You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your trapped in my mind host, Abraham.
And I'm your Am I Anything More Than a Body host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do and their feelings and their thoughts and whether or not those thoughts are biologically linked or maybe they're just existing out there in the ether. That's some of the stuff that we talk about.
Yes, we do, which is always really fun. Maybe one day we'll talk about Plato's cave. But for now, we are not talking about that. We are going to talk about how your brain and how your body are linked together, or are they the same thing?
Exactly. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're so happy to have you. If you're listening to this on the day that it publishes out into the world, ready for your ears, then we would like to welcome and celebrate with you all our National Oreo Cookie Day.
Yay! It's also National Dress Day, which is really wonderful.
National Frozen Food Day. This has definitely helped a lot of people.
Yeah.
Is being able to preserve and ship or like preserve food for longer.
Yeah, that reminds me, I got to put pizza rolls on my grocery list today. It's National Homework Day. No, I'm sorry. No homework. What am I saying? It is No Homework Day. No homework and Homework Day are the same thing because that means that there's homework on both of those days. It is right. No Homework Day.
There you go. I think many people can get behind that.
Yeah.
I don't foresee most of the academic institutions honoring that today, but consider it, you know?
Yeah.
It's Discover What Your Name Means Day.
Oh.
Mine means Abe of the Ham.
And mine means God's gift, which is hilarious. Another day today is the National White Chocolate Cheesecake Day, which I like that. I'm a big fan of cheesecake in general, so that's fine.
Yeah, I've never been a big white chocolate fan, but yeah, it's all good.
Not even real chocolate. It's a poser.
That is a fact. Speaking of chocolate and white chocolate, it is National Dentist's Day.
Yeah.
So brush your teeth after you have your cake.
I think we established on the last episode, this is a day that you're a big fan of because you are the only person in the world who likes to go to the dentist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's part of the Why We Do What We Do lore. This is also Day of the Dude. So that's fun if you like Big Lebowski or just being a dude.
National Women's History Month. Yay.
Yay, because we are in March. It's also National Reading Month, which, you know, I'm a big fan of.
Yeah. Irish American Heritage Month, which makes sense. We got St. Patrick's Day this month.
That's my group, the Irish Americans. It's also National Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month, which we are huge supporters of awareness in this world and support for this world.
We say this often enough. You will all just remember this intuitively. And finally, it is National Cerebral Palsy Awareness Month.
It is. You're absolutely right.
Okay, well, we're actually not talking about the holidays. We are talking about minds and bodies and problems. Mostly those three things linked together: the mind, the body, and the problem, if you will. And yeah, so that's what we're talking about today. If you would like to support us, you can join us on Patreon, pick up some merch, like and subscribe, leave a rating and review, tell a friend about us, all those things. I'll talk more about how you can support us at the end of this episode. But Shane, kick us off with our mind-body problem.
In doing my research, I found this really great quote. I apologize because I cannot find who to attribute this quote to, but this quote goes something like this. The problem of understanding what the relation between the mind and the body is, or more precisely, whether mental phenomena are a subset of physical phenomena or not. End quote. That is the definition of the mind-body problem. What we're trying to discover here and trying to understand here is that many people have discussed this idea that the mind, the idea of our mental phenomenon, our psyches, are different than our physical bodies. They are separate entities, they are separate things, and they are not one and the same. They're not part of the entire organism.
Yeah, and specifically, you might think of this as the mind as a thing manifest by the brain, or is there a distinction there? And an example that is used to help illustrate argument is light and sound. Even though the phenomena are distinctly different, they often occur together and create a specific environmental experience, like lightning.
Yay! Love lightning. Ka-chow. The philosophical question of the mind-body problem was originally developed by French philosopher René Descartes. I've seen this kind of pronounced a lot of different ways, but my understanding is it's Descartes.
That's mine as well.
Okay, good. And so this came up during the 17th century, and Descartes contributed a great deal to modern philosophy by focusing on epistemology, rationalism, and Stoicism. So it's important to note that his work was directly opposed by folks in the empiricist school of thought, like Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, to name a few. But we're going to deep dive on some of his life and his work in a different episode. Right now, we're talking about kind of this idea that he posed, which is this idea of the mind-body problem.
The main point to this problem is the question, are our mental states physical or metaphysical? And the reason that we arrive at this point is because the argument being made here is that the mind is separate from the brain, hence the mind-body question, if you will, and understanding like how would we even know is kind of the problem, or like what would it mean if it was separate? What would it mean if it was not? And that creates this sort of conundrum in terms of how do we try and understand this?
Right. And so this leads to this philosophy or this idea within psychology, which is this idea of dualism. And we're going to talk about dualism and monism in a little bit, but there are a few different perspectives about this, and it comes from the dualism space. There's substance dualism, property dualism, and physicalist reductionism. So substance dualism, it comes from the idea that the mind and the body are two different substances. So, and this is kind of like when we talked about humors, and we talked about all those things that people used to talk about when it came to like understanding how the body worked. The idea of substance dualism is that the mind and the body are two different substances, one being metaphysical and the other being physical. So there is a physical body, and then your mind exists in a metaphysical plane as a different substance than your own body.
And then there's property dualism. And in this idea, there is only one body, but mental phenomena cannot be characterized or limited to physical properties.
Isn't that fun? And there's also physicalist reductionism, which means the properties of mental phenomenon can be described through physical properties. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. And you might be going, well, these all seem similar enough. And that's kind of my experience with, I don't know, just looking at philosophy in general. It's kind of like a lot of people have a lot of ideas about the same thing, and they just come up with a lot of different names about the same thing, and it's all really annoying. And that's why I don't spend a lot of time sitting in coffee shops talking to philosophers, because it drives me nuts. Because it's kind of like, you're just saying this, and they're like, but no, it's metaphysical. And it's like, but no, you're saying this. And that's why I don't do this anymore.
Well, I tend to love philosophy, but I think not in the sort of splitting hairs pontification that you kind of come to expect from questions like this one, the mind-body problem, because it seems like it's where some of the conversations end up in some of the philosophical readings that I've experienced, and I am by no means an expert on all of the different philosophers who have ever existed, but it gets down to like these really nitpicky definitions of this means this, therefore this conclusion.
Sure.
And someone else says, no, A means something different, therefore different conclusion. And they're sort of arguing about whether A means this thing or this other thing. And it kind of doesn't matter, because if you just simply say, you're essentially saying that if there is this definition, then there's this outcome. If there's a different definition, there's a different outcome. And it is okay for those things to be different. Anyway, we don't need to get all into that. Point being that I think a core of understanding this problem, this idea of the conundrum of the mind-body experience and link, is that there is an accounting of mental and physical phenomenon occurring as distinct, separate experiences regardless of relation. The mind operates as a separate research interest different from the brain, rather than as a function of neurological processes. And that second part is sort of the physicalist, reductionist approach of saying, I think, is a function of brain processes. Therefore, the mind question is a brain question, which means there's not a distinction between the two. Or philosophically, is the mind something wholly unique and special that like we need a brain for, but it is its own thing?
Right. You're going to see a lot of the discussion in this being that the mind is separate and it is not a brain problem. That's kind of a dualist approach or dualism approach, where the monism approach is that your brain itself is matter, it is a substance, and anything that comes of the mind is a product of this physical entity, which is also part of your body, which means that you are one. Your mind and your brain and your body are all one together, it's kind of like Jesus,
the Holy Trinity.
Yeah, the Holy Trinity. Like this is kind of the Holy Trinity of psychology. Your mind, your brain, and your body are all together. They're all linked, and they're all holy.
Fair enough.
The Catholic Church is going to come after this podcast so quick. I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting for some bishop to show up and be like, the Pope is mad at you. And then we would say, can we interview the Pope? And that won't happen.
I would definitely say the Pope listens to our podcast.
100%.
Yeah. This comes as a great surprise to me that he listens to any podcast, let alone an English-speaking one, let alone our English-speaking podcast.
Listen, when we look at our data, we've got listeners all over the world, and there is one specific listener in Vatican City, which is really surprising, and that's the Pope.
Just one, yeah. That's pretty good. I never looked to see if we have listeners in Vatican City. If you are, you should definitely write to us and let us know, and we will tip our hat to you.
Yes, please.
Pope. Anyway, yeah, so we've been talking about this idea of a break in the physical structure of our body and the nebulous structure of the mind, and the break in the audio experience of the podcast and the advertisers that must scissor their way in. Okay, so we were trying to leave it a little bit on a cliffhanger of of dualism versus monism or monism, and it's worth unpacking the difference between these two because so much of the philosophy on this topic relies on a debate or distinction between those schools of thought, if you're in the dualism camp or the monism camp.
Yes, there's a really great image that I think if you pull it up here, it kind of gives a nice little diagram of kind of understanding the concept of dualism versus monism and looking at the different types of monism and what that looks like, which is kind of fun. It breaks down Cartesian dualism versus physicalism, idealism, and neutral monism and all that stuff. And so there's a really nice little diagram that is, oversimplifies how the brain works, but it is fun to kind of look at.
Yeah.
I think what we got to start with is this idea of dualism. And dualism posits that the mind and body are two distinct things, like we kind of mentioned. So I already mentioned this idea of substance dualism, which is basically saying that your mind and your body are two different substances. They're made up of entirely different things. I always found this interesting within philosophy, this idea that there is kind of these substances, these ideas, like forms and stuff like that exist on this metaphysical plane. Us as humans kind of pull stuff from that. We pull ideas, we pull thoughts, we pull things from these different kinds of planes. And that's what substance dualism really gets into when it comes to the mind, is that mind is directly linked to these metaphysical substances, that metaphysical plane, and we have to pull so much of what our thoughts are and our feelings are and our psyches are from those places.
And that is how we become planeswalkers.
I like that.
Is a Magic the Gathering joke.
For those of you who didn't know.
Yeah. So we already talked about these, but just as a quick, it's important, I think, to come back to them because this is how we're unpacking this discussion here. Is you had mentioned substance dualism, then there's the property dualism, and this is the difference between the mind and the body are in its properties, not in the physical substance. So we're basically saying, like, yes, okay, mind is brain stuff, that's fine, but the properties of it are still unique and wholly distinct from the physical properties,
right?
In terms of the property features of it, if you will. This is also related to the idea of emergentism, but that's not really something we're going to unpack in this discussion.
Yeah, you're also going to learn there's a lot of isms in this.
Yeah.
So, I think that happens a lot in philosophy. There's, stoicism and emergentism and dualism and monism and all that fun stuff. You'll see there's even more. We're going to unpack. It's like Pokemon. There's so many. Now, in monism, there's also predicate dualism. We're not going to get to monism yet. Predicate dualism simply means it doesn't matter if the mind and the brain are different substances. We cannot reduce mental descriptions to physical descriptions. And that's kind of different than what we talked about, the property, physical reductionism is what I mean. Predicate dualism is the idea that it really doesn't matter whether your mind is metaphysical or not. It doesn't matter if your body is different or not. You just cannot explain mental processes through physical descriptions, which, for my neurology folks out here, isn't that fun?
Yes, you can.
I just hear all of our neurology folks going, neuroscience is just up in arms about this. They're like, there's no way.
Well, and that brings us, I think, to the part where most of us maybe find ourselves, particularly those who are in the neurology side of things. And this is monism. This is the existence is attributed to oneness or singleness. There are varieties of monism that we'll unpack really quick, but this essentially says that the mind and the body are not separate. The brain and the experience of mind is just a product of brain. Essentially, the organism is the sort of central important figure here, and the mind is just an experience that gets to come with that.
Yeah. As I was going through these notes and kind of putting this together, I was thinking that there are some people that would have an absolute meltdown about like thinking about how your mind and your brain work and consciousness works and all this stuff. And like, I don't think that people really think enough about that, but there is like this level where you go, oh, like my entire awareness is just electrical currents coursing through meat. Mm-hmm. People just kind of like, they lose it after that. Right. You know, and I'm 38 and I've had this existential crisis where I go, I am simply just organic matter with electricity in it. And that is a strange feeling to have. And so when you get into philosophy, it makes you do that, I think. I don't know if you have that experience, but it makes me do that.
Totally.
Where I go, what does it mean to be?
Yeah.
You know?
I think it maybe belies our faithful or lack thereof leanings, if you will. But it gets into the like, I am basically a bunch of chemical reactions that will eventually stop happening. And all the experiences that I have as that they're just a fleeting byproduct of the fact that those things occur, which to me raises the inquiry about like what other life could be if you think about it as being sort of a chemical reaction type process.
Sure.
And I'm like, well, there's lots of chemical reaction type processes out there. Do they all have an experience? Like, where does it get to the point where I then think about this? Like, I don't know if like fire is a chemical reaction. Is it thinking? Does it have like a life? It doesn't seem to have a physical structure like a brain, so maybe not. Anyway, that's the like.
These are things that we think about.
If you've been smoking a joint and I blew your mind, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Or if you're not smoking a joint and now you're having a crisis, like it's okay. We'll get through it. It's just be present, like reorient, do the 5 senses exercise. You'll be back. Let's talk about monism. There's priority monism, which means all things go back to the source. Basically, what that means is when we all die, we return to prior matter forms, which, you know, I am good with that. Like that feels right. We're all stardust, baby.
Yeah, but aren't we already matter forms? Like, how do we return to matter forms? That would imply that we're not already matter forms.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point. You're better at philosophy than I am.
The next one is existence monism. This is the idea that the universe is a single thing and everything is a subset of that said thing. I find that makes some sense to me. I can get on board with that.
Yeah, I feel peace with that.
We're all one.
It's also a very Buddhist philosophy,
right?
Which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
There's substance monism. It means that only one kind of substance exists and everything is made up of that substance.
Dark matter.
Yeah, we're all dark matter. And this is actually this is a really great argument against the mind-body problem, since it suggests that like we're all made up of either mind or matter. Like it's basically just saying though that we are all matter, we are all one substance. There cannot be two substances, which means the mind cannot be separate from the body.
I see. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So it's sort of challenging the very premise of the idea of the mind-body problem. Yeah.
Yes.
Of dualism specifically, not the mind-body problem, which, I mean,
right.
arguably is dualism.
Right.
All right. So then we have dual aspect monism, which almost sounds like a contradiction in terms. But all right. So this is mental and physical phenomena are two aspects made from the same substance.
Right.
That sort of, I think, comes back to this idea of like having different properties maybe, but they're still essentially the same thing. They just are maybe described differently.
And then there's neutral monism, which is that reality is neither mental nor physical, which is, I think, really fun.
Yeah.
Because when you start kind of like questioning what is reality, I mean, let me pause right there. Don't start questioning reality, because I don't want you all, like, we've already kind of we've taken you on this like Bill and Ted's bogus journey type of experience through philosophy and existential crises. So don't start questioning reality. But if you want to pause it and come back to this, there is a fun thing about like your body existing in a space and your brain and kind of your consciousness existing in a space that you kind of go, well, what is reality? Let's define reality. Can we even define reality? And then kind of spiraling that way. But those are conversations that are better left to mushrooms or acid or weed. Like, spend some time on that stuff and do it if you're gonna have that conversation.
I think we've maybe overprescribed the use of illicit substances in this episode.
Do it where it's legal is what I meant to say.
I mean, I would say that I think if, again, whether we want to go down this philosophical rabbit hole or anybody wants to join us is up for debate. But in thinking about reality, and when we say reality, like that's just a word. Like if you really think about the, like all the things we would try and describe about what reality is or what it could mean and all of that, it all comes down to the fact that we're just depending on language to represent a thing that is abstract. And like we only have a concept of, we don't really have, it's not a reference to a tangible thing, really.
Right.
It's kind of it's a reference maybe to the idea that all things are tangible. But again, if it's an idea, that's not an actual thing, right? An idea is not a thing. And so if we just think, again, sorry, going down the rabbit hole here, or the wormhole, whatever you choose to call it, it essentially means that we have nothing to say about reality because nothing we say is anything like it just is part of the fabric of reality, and it doesn't even matter what those words are. Right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying here is that like trying to distinguish those things as if we can talk about reality by stepping outside of it somehow means that we ultimately would have nothing to say. We'd simply observe. We just kind of sit in the world that exists around us.
Sure.
And that gets to, there's a whole principle like down the philosophical rabbit hole that I think this has been something that J.R. Cantor sort of raised that I think was criticized by people who sort of say, like, if we decide that we're going to sit here and say nothing, we're going to accomplish nothing as a science. We don't need to get into that debate now.
Sure.
But I think just sort of saying, like, philosophically understanding that as we try and start unpacking what reality is, we're just using words, and those words don't have any inherent properties that particularly illuminate or change anything about how the universe works. Right?
Right. I think one of the things I struggle with any sort of conversation about philosophy is that I come from such a grounded, like my training is such a grounded science, right? And there is a philosophy of science and there's a philosophy of all that behind it. And I understand that like so much of psychology and behaviorism and all this stuff does come from philosophical roots, right? Like we can't ignore philosophy as part of our scientific upbringing, if you will. I feel like for me, I am so far removed from the original teachings of philosophy influencing psychology in that way that it's almost like it doesn't make any sense anymore to me, if that makes sense. Like, you know what I mean? Fair. Like it's I think it's one of those things where it's kind of like when you read older literature and the languaging and the wording and the experiences are just so unique and different to that time that today in modern society, we cannot relate to that because we understand so much more about stuff, you know, or like we have a different understanding of it. And I think that's kind of my overall experience with philosophy, and I think that's why I struggle with it. And now, when it comes to ethics and having questions of ethics and stuff like that, I feel like ethics is a different conversation because I think that it's still very ever present in our world, and we spend a lot of time talking about ethics and ethical behavior and what does that mean. That's so in strength in what we do. But all this other stuff, I'm just kind of like, I don't spend any time talking about this because we know so much about this stuff now that it almost makes the underlying philosophy for those things obsolete in a way. Not entirely, but just like obsolete or like kind of a historical relic, if you will.
So here's where I come down with that. Because like on the one hand, I think that was a beautifully circuitous route to, I think, the next discussion we want to have. And I say beautifully because I really like how that created a nice segue into this, which I think speaks to the fact that if we are looking at this from a very pragmatic lens and thinking, to what extent do we need this to be effective as scientists, right? And I think I generally am a big defender of the philosophy of things because philosophy essentially sets the limits on what our definitions are.
Sure.
It sort of helps us understand how do we keep our language about our field consistent and useful, I think, and by agreeing what warrants a discussion and what doesn't, like what kind of things are inside of the realm of what makes sense for us to try and unpack and consider, and what things don't. And I think that there's like, and then how do we then unpack those things? And so that's essentially where I think I would defend philosophy, and I don't think that's actually different in any way than the point that you're making. But I think, as I said, it brings us around to the fact that, like, when we're thinking about pragmatically, what does it matter if we understand, like, if we're acting with respect to the circumstances of what is working and what it isn't in our field, in our practice, like, we kind of can just chase that, right? We can kind of just follow along with, like, do what makes sense when things are working, and then that's like, yeah, that's good. And we try something, it's not working, and we're like, okay, we discard that part of it. And it just comes back to, how do we be effective at our jobs and our field? So I would defend the use of philosophy, as I think that it sets a critically useful foundation, and that we do want to stay in touch with that. And the sort of really big heady ideas about what it means to talk about what reality is probably doesn't affect very much of our day to day, if you will.
Sure.
And so that really then brings us to the point of, as a general rule, it seems like the mind-body problem isn't a problem.
Right.
It seems that the interactions between our physical and our psychological functions doesn't really change our experience. When we're sad, mental, we cry, physical, all of those things happen inside of a single monistic experience, if you will, that is part of us having a brain and a body and moving through the circumstances of our environments.
Right. Maybe something I should say is, like, I'm a believer of, like, respecting the classics too. Like, so, like, I do have that, like you can't go forward without understanding the classics. I guess, and that's where you pinned it down, is like, I tend to be very pragmatic in the way that I look at the world. And so, like, I don't find, like, day-to-day use in philosophical discussions. Whereas, like, you know, I'm not saying they're not useful. It's just not where I find the most, because I tend to be very solution focused. So I don't have that, like, you know what we should talk about? We should talk about why everything matters. You know, like, I don't have that in me, because on a day-to-day basis, I'm like, why does this matter for you today in this space? Let's work on this, you know?
I think most people would agree with you, and I think that that's perfectly reasonable. Yeah, so I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah.
So
there we go. We made it. So we have arrived. I love it. I don't think that this podcast would be as successful as it was if you and I disagreed on literally everything. So,
right. If it's like such a fundamental thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's good that we have alignment.
We have landed in a nice cathartic place, and that's an okay time to give sort of a cushion to the advertisers. Cushion's not the word, but like a space for them.
Yeah.
But that's all the break we need. We're back.
Yeah. Welcome back. So in this section, what we're talking about now is kind of what all of the mind-body problem issues imply. So today, what we understand is that mental processes are explained as causal factors for biological changes. So we know that when biological changes happen, these mental things happen. We understand that there are diagnoses and disorders that are directly related to neurological functioning or lack thereof, or discrepant types of functioning. Essentially, what we're kind of saying is that the mind is the thinking, feeling entity of our experience. Our bodies are the only biological vessels that we have, but the mind-body problem implies that they don't think or feel. Like, our body doesn't think or feel when our mind does. And that's kind of what the mind-body problem is trying to get at, is that our mental processes are not related to our biological processes in that way. So the reason our bodies can do anything is because, and we know this, the reason our bodies can do anything is because our mind creates these sequence of effects that lead to bodies reacting, or so on and so forth. That's kind of what it's saying, right? We know today that all of it's linked in, all of it's looped in together. These chemical reactions, these processes are happening, and they are influencing the way that we work and we move and we adapt to our environment. But also we know that the environment acts upon our bodies. So there are just so many things that are going on, and it's so enmeshed that, like, I think it's genuinely impossible to untangle them in the way that they tried to originally.
Yeah, assuming that they are tangled in the first place, or not, right. You know, that they're maybe distinct. And I think we're starting to get to what, to me, is the death blow to the idea of the mind-body problem, because we're starting to beg the question, how can something that is non-physical, in this case the mind,
right,
influence something physical, which we're talking about as the body? And today we spent quite a bit of time discussing the impact of language on our behavior, right? We've talked about that quite a bit inside of this.
Right.
But we might argue that there's a difference because we can monitor and evaluate things like thinking, language, etc., that we couldn't before, particularly if we didn't have like a mind, if you will. So they're no longer non-physical compared to descriptions of the mind. And so we're starting to get to the point of understanding the major flaw, I think, at dualism is trying to assume that there are two separate planes of existence that are interacting with one another somehow.
Right. I think one of the fun things that's kind of come out of the mind-body problem is this understanding of the Turing test. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically the idea that we can create a machine that sufficiently mimics the mind and how the mind works. And so what we've found is that we can get pretty close, or we can do certain things that calculate and compute and do all these different things. It doesn't necessarily mimic the complexity of a brain. And we had our conversation with our friend about AI and what that means, and kind of like that the fact that AI is not quite as close as people think it is to mimicking the human brain. But if the mind is a separate entity, then we would not be able to create machines that could mimic the mind. If the mind is a metaphysical thing, then we would not be able to create machines that mimic it, because that is taking something that is metaphysical and turning it into and moving it into the physical plane. So like, to me, as I'm looking at the Turing test as like an example of how the mind-body problem is not really a problem, the reason I kind of land on that is because if the mind is a unique human experience, then we wouldn't be able to get close to it with machinery. I don't know. That's kind of where I land on that.
You're not wrong. And I think that it starts to get into a discussion I've had about whether or not AI could become conscious, and sort of thinking about the part of the issue with that whole idea at all is the misunderstanding of like all of the things that create the experience of being sort of conscious and human, if you will, that are unique to us. And one of those is being centrally located in a point in space and time.
Right.
And AI exists in like an undefined network of sort of invisible space, right? So
Right.
It can't even orient to the world in the same way that we can, because the world does not sit in a position relative to AI. And that's, we don't need to get down that rabbit hole anymore. But yeah, exactly. And I think for those people who want to sort of pedantically write in, yes, we understand that the Turing test was more about, can any kind of machinery trick someone into believing that it is human?
Right.
And that's sort of what the test part of it implies. I think that just leave it for now, understanding that what we're saying is that suggests that it is creating sort of an artificial version of a human mind.
Right. Which would also then mean that it's creating an artificial metaphysical plane.
Right. Yes.
So it's worth, I think, diving into this idea of maybe our philosophy around science and understanding the world and our worldview, but also understanding kind of how things have shifted and changed since Descartes came out and started talking about this. And just like old psychological viewpoints, what we have found is that there are certain aspects of this that are not observable. The mind itself is not observable. It's not measurable. Rather, what we understand about it today is that there are complex neurological processes that occur that can be observed through special instrumentation. We can actually observe neurons firing and synapses firing. We can observe all these things happening, but we can't observe the substance that is the mind that is often discussed in this. We can't actually see the metaphysical substance that is kind of discussed as part of this mind-body problem.
Unless you, of course, mean the brain, and that we can observe.
Yeah. That's a cool substance.
This question is strictly a dualism problem in a philosophical sense. Monistic philosophy doesn't ask the same question, but rather indicates that the mind and body are part of the same system. And I think there's a lot of objective evidence for this too, because you don't get to have any evidence of there being a mind without a body.
Right.
And the body is a prerequisite condition for mind. And I think in addition to that, it is the consideration of thinking we also see that the effect of damage to the body has a marked and observable, like particularly the brain, a marked and observable relation to then how what looks like what might be considered the mind shows up for us, which is to say how people behave, what they say, what they suggest that they think based on their actions. And it just makes philosophical sense too, of like, if the brain is the necessary and requisite feature of this, and out of that we get an experience that we've decided to call mind, even though it's just an experience, it's just what the brain's doing, right? And that's just the thing that's happening. It has to be part of the same thing. Like, I don't know how we'd possibly extract those two systems other than hypothetically and arbitrarily.
Right. And again, I know this is my bias and it comes from my training and my worldview and all that, but in the applied science world, there are a few things that I think are worth getting back to and understanding about, like, kind of the functionality or the practicality of this. And first is that we don't really have an agreed upon definition of the mind itself as an empirical phenomenon, just like we don't for consciousness. This is something that we really struggle with spending time defining and describing in a way that's agreed upon within the community, within the science community. So we don't have a really great way to even study this concept of mind because we can't agree on what it is to begin with.
Right. We know that the body reacts to the environment, which does account for public and sort of private events and stimuli, and that it therefore works like the rest of our behavior works, whether or not sometimes we can directly identify or label that that's the case.
Right. And as of this recording, which is in 2024, because when maybe people discover this podcast in 100 years, they're going to be like, oh my God, they were so wrong. Right. But right now, our understanding of how the brain works in our minds and kind of all of that stuff is essentially a neurological or neuroscience question. And our neurology is incredibly complex. And it's uniquely based in biological processes, and anything in and around our brains are all part of biological functions that are shaped by experiences and genetics. So these kind of the nature and nurture elements of the way that our brains work is super important to account for this, and they can all be observed in at least some fashion.
I will say really quickly, as we're sort of getting to the end of this discussion, that I personally don't have a problem with using the term mind in a colloquial sense. And I think that we can understand that, like, going back to what Skinner has said about thinking about this, what other psychologists have said, I think Cantor said something to along these lines, is that, like, the word mind is just a word. And so if we look at the conditions under which we use the word mind, that helps illustrate and illuminate what it is we're talking about. And then I think helps unpack the fact that, like, using the word mind can be a useful, pragmatic thing to do.
Right.
We can talk about the mind as this abstract idea. It's just not a technically precise term, and that's okay. We need technically imprecise terms because we want to have sort of a flexible, colloquial way of discussing things.
Sure.
And so I don't have a problem with the word mind or using the word mind even to talk about psychological phenomenon. We just also understand that it doesn't mean that it's in any way separate or living in a separate plane of existence.
It's fairly harmless.
Yeah.
To use the term mind. Like, I don't think it's like one of those things where it's like, it's not facilitated communication showing up and causing a problem, right? Like using the term mind and kind of like having those discussions is not in itself a problem. I think where it becomes a problem is when we spend time and resources trying to study a thing that we don't really need to. Like, from like that really core issue of the mind itself being an empirical phenomenon, I don't think that that's necessary. Like, I think that we are doing that research in better ways in different fields without having to go down that route of studying the mind by itself. And I think that's kind of where I land on that too. It's like, use mind all day. Like, oh, you're like, your mind is racing. Like, please use all the idioms and all that stuff. We're good with that. Just don't spend time researching it in that way. Like, talk to the neurologist for a little bit, Yeah,
and if we are going to research it, it's understanding, like, how can we leverage this for more practical utility if we feel like we need to. So, yes, cool. I think we find ourselves on the same page, even if it takes us a minute to get there.
Yeah, exactly.
We do have some interesting tidbits. It feels like this could be an appropriate time. I mean, is there ever an appropriate time for ad breaks? No, but this could be a sort of a natural stopping point to do the ads thing. Okay, so let's get to some interesting tidbits here.
As I was researching this, I learned that there were so many isms, especially like in the world of philosophy. There was, just as a couple examples, there was interactionism, there was epiphenomenalism, epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism. Okay, that's thank you, Abraham. Appreciate that. Psychophysical parallelism. There is double aspectism, occasionalism, Neoplatoism, non-dualism, etc., etc., etc. I think we've got enough, though. I think that's all we need right now. We already mentioned Stoicism and all those things too. So there's a lot. There's a lot there when it comes to philosophy.
And prism isn't.
Prism is a good word. I like prism.
Same. So Descartes had some prevailing health conditions that allowed for accommodations at his school. His accommodation, he was allowed to sleep in an extra 5 hours compared to other students. So that's nice.
Isn't that great?
Wow.
What an accommodation. Like when I was reading that, I was like, man, how do you get that today? Like right now, accommodations in college are like, you get time and a half on a quiz.
Right.
And it's like, that's not, or flexible due dates. It's like, no, I want extra sleep time. Thank you.
Yes, for all things, for work, for appointments, 5 hour cushion of sleep time, please.
I'm going to get my doctor to write a prescription for that. Let's see if that works.
Ooh, good idea.
Yeah. So I think to kind of wrap up this entire discussion, and I think that you all need to send us medals and accolades and stuff for getting an episode under an hour. Like, that's something that we have not done in some time. So you're welcome for that. But a couple things that I think are important to kind of take away from this is that I think philosophy is cool, and I think it is important to have those discussions. But as somebody who tends to be solution focused and kind of like in the now, like I have a hard time entertaining those conversations if it doesn't lead to something that I can take into a practical setting. And so like that's where, and we kind of like discussed that a little bit earlier. What I find is that for me, a lot of these intellectual exercises tend to lose their stimulating properties when we start getting into the science. Like, so we can have those discussions, but when we get into the science of it and kind of what we know today, I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense anymore. That's kind of lost to history because we understand this thing better. And Descartes offered a great question that today is more thoroughly answered than it was during his time. I think that we have a better understanding of the mind, quote unquote, the mind body problem today than we ever did. And that's true for most of the philosophy questions that we came up with in psychology. But I do think that that's an important takeaway. Is like, while that was a great exercise in the 17th century, today we understand so much more about it that question is no longer relevant to me.
That mind-body problem was never really a problem. One last sort of take-home point I wanted to land on, which maybe should have been more part of the actual discussion, but it is in a dualistic sense, there's sort of two major problems. One is that if you assume that you have two separate things that are existing in sort of different realms, if you will, different realities, we know that they're linked, but we're treating them as if they're separate. You then have to assume, even if we assume that they're in the same reality, but they're somehow not implicitly and inextricably linked, the mind and the body, is that we then have to account for what the mind does using a somehow different set of variables than what the body does, what the circumstances are for the physical features of things. And sort of what then happens is we then have to say, like, there's something that accounts for the mind and something different that accounts for the body. And as far as we can actually tell, there is no separate set of circumstances that account for the mind.
Right.
And it really doesn't make sense, because then again, we're assuming that like what happens to the body is irrelevant for what happens with the mind. And we know that what happens to the body is the only thing that matters as far as what happens to the mind.
Right.
And so there's the problem of cause-effect relations sort of across these planes of reality or existence, or like how they're supposed to be separate. And then there's also the problem of understanding how the different variables must affect those things when they're different realms. And that to me is the killing blow to the idea of dualism, is that they have to have different mechanisms of circumstance that apply to them uniquely and differently and separately, and they have to somehow influence each other across that thin membrane of reality that seems to separate them. And I think that just doesn't make any sense. Like, we just can't even consistently assume that. So
right.
Whew.
I think you nailed it. It don't make no sense.
Such a philosophy heavy episode. I hope that I love this kind of stuff personally. I hope that it was at least intellectually stimulating for most of you. I think there are going to be people who hear this who are like hardcore on the camp of no, the mind is separate. And the thing is, like, fine. Just try, consider unpacking it in the way that we've described here. I think, try and understand like the dualistic problem that it arises as treating them as separate. And then the people who are very firmly in the camp of like, I think where we're at, which is the monistic perspective, is these are all sort of part of the same thing. Either they'll have heard this and say, yeah, of course, everybody knows that, duh, turn it off. Or they'll be like, okay, I haven't thought about it that way. I'm hoping you're the latter camp, most of you, that this was interesting enough to maintain your attention and not so philosophy heavy that your eyes are watering at this point.
Right. And again, it's just one of those things where we are a psychology podcast. This is a question that comes up in psychology, and it has for centuries. So it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about it in current context.
Yeah, and I would say that for the most part, as I think you pointed this out earlier, most people aren't really having a lot of this conversation too much, but I have heard people espouse the idea that the mind and the body are separate entities very recently, like within the last 6 months, on a podcast. So this is not a totally dead notion, and that's why it felt relevant to bring it up and discuss it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, well, if you're still with us, congratulations. You are a trooper. Glad you made it through this this journey with us. Glad to have you here. That was fun for me. Hopefully for you too.
Me too.
And so if you did like what we did here today and you're like, yes, more of that, please. I want my eyes to water all the time. You can join us on Patreon. You can support us by picking up some merch. You can leave us a rating and review, subscribe, give someone a giant gift and tell them about this philosophy heavy podcast you heard today. All those things. And if you do join us on Patreon, then I will read your name. I will herald your name, in fact, if that makes any sense at all, with this list of people who are just generous, wonderful people who support us, and we really appreciate them. And that is Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all. You are the best.
Love y'all.
Also, I need my team of people to help me with this. Otherwise, I would be talking into a microphone, not even bothering to edit it and send it out into the world as just one person's stream of consciousness, and nobody would listen. So thank you, everybody who helps me with this show, which is Shane and I do writing and fact checking. Shane, you took the lead on this one this time. Thank you so much for recording with me today and for your work on this.
Thank you.
Justin Greenhouse is our audio editor and making sound good magician. So thank you, Justin.
That's his job role. That's its title. Making sound good.
Make sound good. That was the whole job description. And our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. We do have some recommendations, which if you're joining us for the first time and you probably skipped all the way to the end because I didn't billboard this soon enough, we like to recommend some things. Is there anything, Shane, that I forgot or you would like to add before we recommend those things?
Nope, I think we're good. Recommendations. So I recently finished a book called Black House by Stephen King and Peter Straub. I loved it so much. Here's the thing. You have heard me, everybody here has heard me, and you and I share this interest. We have a shared interest about The Dark Tower. Yeah. Stephen King's The Dark Tower, and how great that magnum opus is of Stephen King's. Well, if you're familiar with Stephen King's work, he does all kinds of books and all kinds of works that are tangentially related to The Dark Tower because all things serve the beam. Well, Black House is a sequel to the book Talisman. Talisman was a tie-in to early Dark Tower lore. Black House is a direct tie-in to Dark Tower, and it is so good. It is the most explicit Dark Tower book that's not a Dark Tower book that I have ever read. Okay. I mean, and when I say explicit, I'm talking about it mentions breakers, it mentions in-world and mid-world and end-world, it mentions the baronies, it mentions gunslingers and the Crimson King. It's all there, and it's beautiful, and it was so good. And it's cool because this book is more of a detective story that involves Dark Tower weirdness. Okay. It's done so well, and it was the writing in it is beautiful. Some of my favorite characters ever are in this book. This group called the Thunder Five, which are like these really intelligent bikers. Like it kind of subverts the idea of what bikers are. They're like really tough, badass bikers, but they like spend their time sitting in a bar talking philosophy. So it's like in poetry and stuff. Cool. They're so good. It's a really great book. You have to read The Talisman to get a better feel for this one because it is a sequel, but it's a great read. And I recommend it to everybody for sure.
Sounds like you probably need to have read the Dark Tower books as well.
It helps.
Okay.
But this book actually, this book though came out before Wolves of the Calla. So it came out after the fourth. It came out in the middle of the Dark Tower series, before the Breakers showed up, before all that stuff came out. So like you can read it without having that understanding, but it is enhanced by having the understanding of the Dark Tower.
Okay. All right. Good to know. I am intrigued. Cool. Black House by Stephen King and Peter Straub.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I am recommending a board game, back on brand for me. This one is, it's been out for a little while. It's still pretty new, though. I think it came out within the last few months, really. This is a board game called The Fox Experiment. It's based on these, if people are familiar with this history, Dmitry Mendeleev, I think I'm saying that right. And this took place, I believe, in Russia, maybe Serbia, and they were essentially trying to breed foxes to be very friendly and docile, like sort of dog companions.
Okay.
It's kind of a brutal story. It maybe is worth unpacking as an episode or maybe a mini or something. And so the game, I think, shies away from the more brutal aspects of the actual story, but the game is just, it's really, really smart. Like, it looks complex, and then you get into it and it's like, oh, that's pretty straightforward. Like, I get it.
Right.
And it's one that it kind of builds on itself. So as the game goes, they just kind of like, you get better and better turns every time, which feels kind of good. So it's like, at first you can't do very much, but then as you get better and better things, like you can do more on your turn. You're almost like an RPG in that way, like as you level up, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is The Fox Experiment. People who are really in the board game hobby may recognize the designer's name is Elizabeth Hargrave, who also designed Wingspan. The Fox Experiment is published by Pandasaurus Games, so a different publisher than Wingspan.
I love that.
Yeah. So people, if you're interested in it's sort of heavier on the strategy side, but it's not one of the majorly complex games. It's just it's more complex than like Sorry, which is pretty easy to do.
Right.
Anyway, there's The Fox Experiment by Elizabeth Hargrave by Pandasaurus Games.
That's so fun. I love it.
Okay, we still did it under an hour.
Yay!
If you would like to tell us about the mind-body problem, something that we got right, a board game or a book that you are interested in and would like to share with people, you can write to us directly. Email us at info@wwd.wwdpodcast.com or reach out to us on the various social media platforms. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or that I forgot before we sign off today, Shane?
No, I think that covers it. Mind your body.
Mind your body. Keep those minds in your body. I think that's it. So this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to wwd.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.